Introducing this bill, the Taoiseach said that the truth is we have too many politicians in Ireland. To address this, he proposes to cut the number of politicians in Ireland by 1/3, cutting over 700 TDs, councillors and senators. One of 5 countries with similar populations to our own that he compared to us in that regard was Finland. In fact, Finland currently has an elected politician for every 550 people, whereas Ireland has one elected politician for every 2,476 people. And in both cases, just to explain, I'm counting the total local and national politicians. After the Taoiseach's cuts, we will in Ireland have one elected politician for every 4,144 people and rising, because our population is increasing year on year. Ireland will then have 1/8 of the elected politicians of Finland. In other words, it's a nonsense to suggest that Ireland has too many politicians compared to countries such as Finland. Norway, too, was one of the 5 mentioned by the Taoiseach. Norway has 169 MPs for a population slightly higher than ours. However, it has 12,000 councillors. It has over 400 local councillors, and it has county councils, which are regional assemblies in reality, for its 19 regions. Norway has more than 10 times the number of elected politicians that we have in Ireland. I could make similar comparisons with and points about the other countries the Taoiseach mentioned in his speech, Denmark, Slovakia and Croatia. Those and other countries have levels of representation at local and regional government that Ireland does not have, both in terms of the number of representatives and self-governing powers. Ireland is a most centralised democracy, and the Taoiseach is proposing, with his cuts at local and national level, to move even more power to the centre. With so few elected politicians in Ireland, politicians will be stretched to the limit in terms of their duties and their capacity to connect with voters, and that will make our political system less representative and less efficient, not more. When it comes to larger countries to whom Ireland is sometimes erroneously compared, some commentators have been arguing that Ireland has too many politicians, the assertion is equally false. If, for example, the UK, France, Germany and Italy have levels of government that Ireland doesn't have and could not have, including directly elected regional assemblies and provincial parliaments, like, for example, in Italy. And just when it comes to our national representation, neither is Ireland overrepresented at national level, and this is irrespective of whether we are compared with countries that have 2 houses of parliament or 1. At the Constitutional Convention this month, it was pointed out by political scientist Professor David Farrell that empirical studies whereby countries of similar population size are compared, Ireland currently is just about right. And just in that regard, there is an accepted formula in political science that places the optimum size of a lower house at the cube root of its population. And the cube root of Ireland's population, according to the 2011 census, is 166. So we've exactly the right number of TDs currently according to that formula, which is widely accepted in the world of political science. And it's empirically tested as well. Interestingly, the convention was polled on whether the number of TDs should be changed, and the majority of convention members, citizens and Oireachtas members, said it shouldn't be changed, but that in the event that it was changed, the majority, or the most members, 48%, favoured increasing our number of TDs, or having more TDs than more than 159. So basically, they wanted to keep within the existing constitutional range. And just to say that the cuts to TDs will move us in the wrong direction, as will the proposed abolition of the Seanad and the cuts to councils. But just in relation to TDs, after the next TD election, we will have 1 TD for every 29,000 plus people, compared to Finland's 1 for every 27,180. We currently have the same number of TDs as we had when we had 1.2 million less people. On the other hand, the number of unelected advisors and spin doctors and speechwriters has grown exponentially since then. Power has not just been moved to the centre into the hands of the executive thanks to this government's so-called reforms. It has also been put further into the hands of unelected advisors and spin doctors, many of whom earn more than twice the salaries of senators with no accountability whatsoever. So therefore, it's just populist nonsense for the Taoiseach to say that Ireland has too many politicians. And the Taoiseach has also been anti-politics and anti-democratic when he makes that assertion, and he's contributing to the ongoing denigration of politics, which is good for none of us and is not good at all for our democracy. Now, another assertion made by the Taoiseach that I wanted to address was that he said there's been 10 reports published since 1938 in relation to Seanad reform, and he said yet not a single one published since 1938 has been implemented. Now, that's not true. And I don't know where he's getting his figures from, because he says 10 since 1938, but in the 2004 Seanad Reform Report, which the Minister of State would be very familiar with because he was involved in drawing it up, it referred to 11 reports since 1928. So the 2004 would have made 12. And just in relation to the assertion that those reports haven't been implemented, again, that's not borne out by the facts. And I would refer to a letter written published in the Irish Times recently, which reminded me of this, but a man called Joe Steins wrote a letter, and he said that he went through it, and he says the figure 12 is derived from the 2004 report. He said, it lists 11 previous reports and itself reforms the 12th. Of the 11 earlier reports, those of 1928, 1936, 1947 and 1953 were largely implemented, while those of 1937 and 1959 made almost no recommendations because the committee members disagreed. And the 1967 and 1996 reports were reviews of the entire constitution and obviously made recommendations in relation to the Dáil, which would not have been implemented. So the only report which is both specific to the Seanad and unimplemented was the Seanad's own report in 2004. That's the factual position. I mean, that's borne out by a former clerk of the Seanad, John McGowan Smith, wrote a book about the Seanad, and he goes through some of the reports that were implemented. There was amendments made to Articles 31, 32 and 33 of the Constitution in 1928 following a report of a committee of both houses, which included recommendations in relation to the Seanad. Delaying powers in relation to legislation in the Seanad were introduced at that time. In 1937, obviously, we had the new Seanad introduced. There's a report of the Joint Committee on the Seanad panel elections in 1947, and its recommendations were given effect to in the Seanad Electoral Panel Members Act of 1947, with further modifications made in the Act of 1954 and also in the Act of 1972. And they formed the basis of the election to the Seanad. So that's two key assertions the Taoiseach made in his speech, and they're both incorrect. Now, then the Taoiseach went on to say, he said, no Parliament would abolish a House of Parliament simply to reduce the number of politicians, and that he was in favour of abolition because the Seanad, has not worked. Now, he made no backup of this assertion. There was no in-depth analysis. Unlike our Minister Brendan Howlin, who had put in some thought into the thing, the Minister made no analysis about the benefits or otherwise of bicameralism versus universalism. And he doesn't appear to have any grasp of the purpose of the Seanad in our democracy. And, I would just say as well that, I feel that the Taoiseach, to be so flippant about the Seanad, he's just been caught up, I would feel, or I have the impression that he's caught up so much in the presidential style of leadership, which is totally destroying our Parliament in terms of its accountability, and which is the media laps up to the detriment of all the other members of this and the Seanad, that he doesn't even grasp the purpose of the Seanad. And I mean, the purpose of the Seanad is actually, and I mean, Deputy Hayes or Minister Hayes served in it with me, but the whole purpose of the Seanad is to slow down the passing of legislation and to ensure that that more controversial aspects of the legislation have time to come into the public domain. And I mean, That is very important. That in itself, the mere existence of the Seanad is a deterrent on the government introducing draconian legislation. And I know that Deputy Boyd Barrett said there about the Offence Against the State Act, which we just discussed, is draconian. But I can tell you, if we didn't have a Seanad, it might be a lot more draconian, because having a Seanad, it has to go next to the Seanad, and it means that it gets discussed in both houses. It's more a chance to come in the public domain. It's a deterrent on the government overstepping the mark, and giving too many powers to the state against the citizen. I mean, legislation, the other purpose is obviously to improve legislation, allow time for spotting of flaws. There have been, legislation has been introduced by senators over the years, and I can give a few examples of that. Just in relation to some of the good legislation that's passed, Mary Robinson introduced the first bill to make contraceptives available in 1973, and it was a very brave move at the time. She got a lot of abuse, for a lot of flack, including hate mail, for that. Mary Henry would be another example. She had her private member's bill in relation to child sex tourism was incorporated into the Government Sexual Offences Jurisdiction Act in 1996. And, there have been many other amendments made by senators in the Seanad that have been accepted over the years in relation to legislation by the government. And for example, my own experience when I was a senator and I was spokesperson for in relation to justice, I put amendments to legislation that were accepted by the government that actually mattered. They mattered, and that's something the teacher doesn't seem to grasp, that the nitty-gritty of going through legislation and not just making sound bites, and positioning himself. It actually matters. It mightn't be glamorous, and there's many famous senators, there's many less famous senators who were effective in the role. And just in relation to my own experience, the immigration legislation that I dealt with in Seanad was amended by me, thanks to amendments put by myself and my party, that improved the citizens' rights vis-à-vis the legislation so that they would have due process in the courts. And that's just one example. In relation to legislation...
2 minutes remaining.
Okay, in relation to legislation that has been, bills rejected, there have been bills rejected in the Seanad. As late as 2001, a bill was finally stopped in the Seanad in relation to the publishing of opinion polls. In 1959, the bill to put the referendum to the people to abolish PRS-TV and to bring in single-seat first-past-the-post constituencies was rejected by the Seanad. It was delayed, and that delay has been said to have contributed to the fact that the public then had more time, and they decided to reject the government's proposal to abolish PRS-TV, and we can thank the Seanad to this day for that. And I would say it's obviously contributed to our peace process. Gordon Wilson made a key speech in the Seanad about inviting the IRA to talk to him in the aftermath of 3 deaths just beforehand in the northern conflict. We take for granted our democracy and our institutions at our peril. It shouldn't be the subject of an after-dinner speech by a Taoiseach when he just needs a headline to grab in the run-up to a monthly opinion poll by a newspaper. It's much more important than that. We have a stable democracy. We've never had a fascist party come to power. We've had a peace process. Many people in both houses have contributed to that. It is really important that we remember that. And what I would say, I suppose, in wrapping up is, I hope when the electorate votes on this, that they look, the Taoiseach has made brave decisions over his career, as do most politicians. But there were brave men and women have served in the Seanad over the years, and I hope in their spirit, when they established this, the Seanad was first established and brought the state out of a civil war, and people who had to take their lives at risk to do that. I hope it's to the spirit of those people that the electorate looks at, and not the sound-biting and the, flippant way that this whole abolition of the Seanad has been proposed by the Taoiseach.
Thank you very much, Deputy Tuffy. I call now on Deputy Anne Ferris. You have 5 minutes. I'll let you know when there's 2, maybe, or 1.
1, please. 1. I have my doubts, Cathaoirleach, about the need for this bill. While I support the passing of the enabling legislation, I must in all honesty say that I do have my doubts about its intent. The decision to abolish a House of Parliament should not be taken lightly, nor rushed through, and in my view that is exactly what's happening this week. The Seanad serves a purpose and abolishing it serves none.